Hello, everyone. This week, week 3, we turn our attention to states. If we accept at least some of the modernist perspectives on the nation, not to mention the historic evidence, we have to accept that states can and do play a role in creating national identities and nations. States are not the only entities that matter, but they are very important. This week, we'll work on understanding some key issues about states. This kind of map probably looks quite normal to you. And that is because from a young age, many of us have gotten used to seeing this kind of map, which divides the whole land area of our planet up into territorial states. The idea of the territorial state is taken for granted. In this lecture, we won't take it for granted, but we will examine the criteria for a modern territorial state, how this idea came to be, and how some kinds of states work. First, what is a state? A state is a set of governing institutions. Think of the parts of the U.S. government, the legislative branch, the Supreme Court, etc., etc. So different institutions. A state also has a population that is governed, and that population resides in a territory with demarcated borders. To be a state, this government must also be recognized by other states. For example, a country cannot become a member of the United Nations unless current member states recognize it. Thus, you can see that in this definition, it's not just some dictionary definition. It is a definition that matters in international law. In the chapter you will read by Painter and Jeffrey, they define the state in somewhat different terms because they want us to see that the state is not just top-down and wrapped up with a neat border. Read these definitions of the state in the slide. An imagined collective actor, a complex network of relations among a shifting mixture of institutions and social groups, the product of state-owned processes of institutional development and historical change, and an institutional ensemble, the mix of institutional forms and practices that create the effect of a state. Now that's pretty complicated and abstract, so let's talk through a couple of them. The state is an imagined collective actor. What does this mean? That we talk about, for example, what the government does. But what is the government? It's actually a bunch of people. Some elected, but many others hired to do specific jobs who do a lot of things. For example, police are not elected. For example, the people who work at the DMV, they're not elected, but they're part of our experience with the state. But we also imagine the government, we often imagine the government to the state to be one big thing. So we imagine it as a collective actor, even when it's a bunch of different parts. They also, Painter and Jeffrey, also want us to see the state as a complex network of relations among a shifting mix of institutions and social groups. Now we can see this idea of the state when we think about how U.S. government agencies have been implementing policy on COVID-19. It's a network of relations. They have different relations. Some government agencies have said to wear masks. Others have said, especially back in spring, that masks aren't that important. And the relationships among these institutions have shifted. Just this week, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services disagreed with the director of the National Institutes of Health regarding how contagious children are. So this has to do with their different institutions. They have different relations to other institutions, and they also have different relations to social groups. Some social groups want that some social groups, the ones that want all schools to be open and in person, they support the Health and Human Services. Major teachers unions are siding with the National Institutes of Health. And then we could also say, well, what about scientists as a kind of social group? Scientists as a social group don't all agree, but right now the majority of epidemiologists and public health folks say that yes, children are contagious. Thus, states are complicated groups of institutions. Sometimes different parts of the state function together so smoothly that we don't notice there are different parts. But what Painter and Jeffrey are saying here is that to understand how the state works, we need to look for the differences among the parts. Painter and Jeffrey also want us to look at where can we find the state? That is, what are the geographies of any state? What are the spatial characteristics of the state? First, remember, states are territories with demarcated or mapped boundaries. Here you can see the logo of the U.S. Border Patrol, who in theory patrol the borders of the U.S. In reality, the Border Patrol actually also operates within the U.S. with several checkpoints up to 100 miles inside the border, with ID checks on Greyhound buses and other practices that we might ask about since they're far from the national border. But anyway, territories with boundaries. We also need to look at how states, second, have territorially organized institutions. For example, there are jurisdictions for, say, the police who operate in a city and the sheriffs who tend to operate throughout a county. And there's the matter of mobility and scale. Once a set of crimes crosses state lines, the FBI, federal and national, so a higher scale than the city or county, Federal Bureau of Investigation may be called in to cooperate with local police or take over a case. Third, there are institutional geographies of the state. By this, political geographers mean what are the material spaces where government institutions work, like government offices, police stations, courthouses, and also how these are symbolic. For example, above each door of the Milwaukee County Courthouse, there is a word inscribed to say something about the court's function, whether we accept it or not. For example, you can see in the picture, this one says justice. Fourth, states have various agencies that administer and surveil the population. That means that many parts of the state are making and using records of us, the people, to do things. Some records of us include our driving record, our vaccination record, and possibly our criminal records. Different state agencies collect information on us, from the U.S. Census, this year in fact, to the DMV. We are watched by different parts of the government, from police and squad cars checking our speed while driving, to the National Department of Homeland Security possibly reading our email. Now, if that is starting to sound like Orwell's 1984, well, political geographers also want to remind us that the real world is not quite like that in most places. Because states have many different parts, what Painter and Jeffrey call spaces or gaps between the parts of the state apparatus, it's hard for a state to control all its people. There are always spaces of resistance. Some might be just in people evading government agencies. A more obvious space of resistance was seen in the Wisconsin State Capitol Rotunda in 2010 when thousands of people were protesting there. But again, there can also be resistance when one government agency challenges another for good or not so good. Last, once we think of the state as a territory, we might also start thinking of it as a place, as a homeland. The song America the Beautiful evokes images of types of places in the United States. So there are these 6 spatial formations that matter for states. Thus far, I've discussed definitions of the state and perspectives or theories of spatialities of the state. Now, in the Painter and Jeffrey chapter, they also discuss theories of state formation, by which we mean answers to the question, how did states form? How did they come into existence? Most scholars agree that modern states have been formed mostly by growth while waging war. Please be sure to read pages 34 to 35 in Painter and Jeffrey on that topic. That is the end of this lecture. Hopefully this lecture gives you some ideas of how we can see some links between national identity and the state. But there is more to come in the next lecture on how states work, or theories of state operation. Make sure to watch that one next.